He wasn't trying to be brave that morning. He was trying to solve something everyone else had accepted as unchangeable. And that quiet refusal to follow the rules would decide who lived and who didn't. At 0700 hours, while mechanics prepared dozens of P-47s for another escort mission into Germany, most pilots were thinking about survival in the usual way. Stay close, turn fast, react quicker than the enemy. But one man stood there looking at the same aircraft and seeing a completely different problem. The bombers they were protecting had been falling in numbers no one could ignore, and every report pointed to the same conclusion. Their fighters simply couldn't compete the way the war demanded. Yet what he questioned wasn't the enemy, or even the machine, but the method everyone trusted. And within hours, he would gamble everything on a decision that didn't look like courage at all. If you think you've heard everything about air combat in World War II, this story is about to prove otherwise. Weeks earlier, before anyone considered changing tactics, Hubert Zemke had already been working through a different kind of problem, one that didn't start in the sky, but in the numbers most pilots ignored. He had spent years as a test pilot, not chasing enemies but evaluating machines, learning how small differences in weight, drag, and power translated into behavior under stress, and that background quietly shaped how he saw the war. Where others saw a fighter that failed to turn tightly enough, he saw a system being misapplied, an aircraft forced into a role it was never designed to win. The P-47 wasn't misunderstood because it lacked ability. It was misunderstood because everyone expected it to behave like something else. Zemke would spend hours with maintenance crews and a young engineering officer named Daniel Harper, a detail-oriented analyst assigned to track performance reports, and together they would go over mission data that most commanders skimmed past: climb rates at different loads, acceleration profiles at altitude, structural tolerances under stress. Harper noticed patterns in the reports that didn't match combat doctrine, and Zemke pushed those observations further, asking a question no one in command seemed interested in answering. What if the aircraft wasn't failing, but the method was? The official doctrine emphasized turning engagements, close-range maneuvering, the kind of aerial combat pilots had been trained for since the early days of the war, and success was measured by how well a pilot could outmaneuver an opponent in that environment. Zemke didn't reject that training outright, but he began to see it as incomplete, built around assumptions that didn't hold for every aircraft. In private discussions, Harper pointed out that the P-47 maintained stability and control at speeds that strained lighter fighters, and Zemke connected that to something larger, something that didn't fit into existing manuals. If an aircraft could operate effectively where others began to lose control, then the engagement didn't have to happen on equal terms. That idea, simple on the surface, carried consequences that reached far beyond a single squadron, but at the time it sounded like theory, not something to risk lives on. The resistance didn't come from incompetence. It came from consistency. The system had worked before. It had produced experienced pilots and measurable results. And changing it meant admitting that the problem wasn't the enemy or the pilots, but the framework guiding them. Zemke wasn't a rebel in the traditional sense. He didn't ignore orders or dismiss authority, but he kept returning to the same conclusion every time he reviewed the data, every time he compared what the aircraft could do with how it was being used. The gap between those two things wasn't small, and it wasn't accidental. It was the result of habit, reinforced over time, repeated until it became invisible. Other pilots focused on survival within that system, learning to adapt, to react faster, to push harder in the same kind of engagement. But Zemke approached it differently, treating each mission less like a fight and more like a problem that hadn't been correctly defined. That difference in approach began to isolate him, not because others dismissed him outright, but because his conclusions implied that everyone else was asking the wrong question. Harper, reviewing another set of reports late one evening, pointed out that the aircraft consistently gained speed faster than it lost it under certain conditions, and Zemke paused on that detail longer than any other, recognizing that it wasn't just a performance metric. It was a potential shift in how engagements could be structured. If speed could be controlled deliberately, then positioning could be controlled. And if positioning could be controlled, then the fight didn't have to follow the expected pattern. That realization didn't look dramatic. It didn't come with urgency or visible pressure. But it marked the point where Zemke stopped trying to improve within the system and started considering what it would mean to step outside it. The difficulty wasn't proving the idea. It was deciding when to act on it, because once that decision was made, it wouldn't stay contained as a theory or a discussion. It would affect every pilot under his command, every mission they flew, and every outcome that followed. And in a war where mistakes were measured in lives, the cost of being wrong wasn't abstract. It was immediate and irreversible. The shift didn't begin with a breakthrough. It began with a series of losses that no one could explain without repeating the same conclusions that had already failed them. Missions continued. Formations held. Procedures followed exactly as instructed. Yet aircraft returned damaged or didn't return at all, and every debrief circled back to familiar explanations: enemy advantage, pilot error, unfavorable conditions, none of which addressed the pattern Zemke had been tracking. He stopped listening to the summaries and focused instead on inconsistencies buried inside the reports. Moments once where engagements broke down, not because pilots hesitated, but because they were forced into situations where their aircraft performed worst. That distinction mattered more than anyone realized, because it meant the outcome wasn't being decided by skill alone. It was being shaped before the fight even began. Zemke brought these observations forward during briefings, not as complaints but as questions, asking why their fighters were consistently entering engagements that neutralized their strengths, and the responses he received were measured, reasonable, and completely resistant to change. Doctrine wasn't designed to be flexible. It was designed to be reliable, and the idea of abandoning established methods in the middle of an active campaign was seen as unnecessary risk. What Zemke was proposing didn't sound like refinement. It sounded like rejection. And that made it difficult for others to accept even when the evidence was in front of them. Harper supported the analysis with compiled data, pointing out that pilots who disengaged earlier and avoided prolonged maneuvering tended to survive at higher rates, but those cases were treated as exceptions rather than indicators. The system favored consistency over adaptation, even when consistency produced predictable losses. Zemke recognized that waiting for approval would only reinforce the same cycle, so he reframed the problem in practical terms. Not as a theoretical argument, but as a decision about how his own group would operate within the limits of their assignments. He didn't announce a new doctrine. He adjusted expectations, instructing pilots to prioritize positioning over proximity, to avoid engagements that forced them into slow maneuvering, and to think about encounters as sequences rather than continuous fights. The language was careful, almost understated, but the implication was clear. They were no longer going to fight the way they had been trained to fight. The resistance this time didn't come from command. It came from within the group itself, from experienced pilots who had built their instincts around close-range combat and saw these changes as hesitation rather than strategy. Zemke addressed that directly, not by arguing against their experience, but by redefining what success meant under these conditions, emphasizing that survival and mission effectiveness were tied to controlling when and how engagements occurred, not to staying in them longer. Harper's role became more visible as he translated performance data into practical guidelines, helping pilots understand why certain behaviors increased their chances of returning, and gradually the conversation shifted from skepticism to cautious testing. The turning point wasn't a dramatic confrontation. It was a quiet agreement to try something different on the next mission, to apply these adjustments in real conditions and observe the results. That decision, small in appearance, carried weight far beyond the immediate outcome, because it introduced a new variable into a system that depended on uniformity. If it worked, it would challenge assumptions that had gone unquestioned for years, and if it failed, it would reinforce them even more strongly. Zemke understood that the risk wasn't just operational, it was conceptual, because once the idea was tested, it couldn't be contained or ignored. It would either expose a flaw in the system or confirm it, and in either case, the consequences would extend beyond a single mission or a single group. The morning they chose to act did not feel like the beginning of a new tactic. It felt like a controlled risk that no one could fully measure until it was already in motion. At RAF Halesworth, before takeoff, the briefing was shorter than usual, not because there was less to explain, but because too much detail would have exposed how much uncertainty was involved. Zemke outlined the plan in simple terms, focusing on positioning, timing, and restraint, avoiding language that would trigger immediate resistance. Yet every pilot in the room understood that what they were about to do would break from everything they had practiced. Harper stood near the back, watching reactions rather than listening to the instructions, noticing who nodded, who hesitated, who avoided eye contact, because the success of what they were attempting depended as much on belief as it did on execution. Once airborne, the formation climbed higher than standard escort patterns required, creating separation not just in altitude but in intent. And that separation introduced a new kind of tension, one that didn't come from the enemy but from the absence of familiar structure. Pilots were used to staying close to the bombers, reacting to threats as they appeared, but now they were being asked to wait, to observe, to delay engagement until conditions aligned with a plan that had never been tested under real pressure. The distance from the bombers felt wrong to many of them, like abandoning the very thing they were supposed to protect, and that discomfort lingered as they reached their assigned position. Zemke monitored spacing and speed carefully, adjusting small details through radio calls that sounded routine but were calculated to maintain a specific advantage that only he and Harper fully understood. Below them, the bomber stream continued forward, predictable, visible, exactly where enemy fighters expected it to be, and that predictability was part of the design, not something to be corrected. The German formations began to assemble ahead, positioning for an intercept that followed their own established doctrine, and for a brief moment, everything aligned with what both sides anticipated, except for one element that remained unseen. Zemke delayed the order longer than some of his pilots were comfortable with, allowing the opposing formation to commit fully to their approach. And in that delay lay the entire weight of his decision, because once the moment passed, there would be no second chance to apply the idea as intended. When the command finally came, it wasn't dramatic, just a shift in direction and intent, and the formation responded, not by turning into a prolonged engagement, but by converting their position into motion in a way that avoided the patterns their opponents expected. The first pass was fast and controlled, not designed to initiate a fight, but to disrupt one before it could stabilize. And pilots who followed the instructions found themselves exiting the engagement before it could trap them in the slower maneuvering they had been trained to expect. Some hesitated, instinct pulling them toward familiar behavior, but those who stayed with the plan noticed something different, not just in what they were doing, but in what they were avoiding. The absence of extended turning engagements changed the rhythm of the encounter, shortening exposure, reducing vulnerability, and creating space to reset rather than react continuously. Harper, listening to fragmented radio calls, began noting how quickly pilots were able to reposition after each pass, something that had rarely been possible under previous methods, and that single observation carried implications that extended far beyond the immediate encounter. The engagement unfolded in segments rather than a continuous struggle, each action followed by separation, each separation preserving options for what came next. And while the outcome was still uncertain in those moments, the structure of the fight had already changed. When the German formation began to break apart, it wasn't because they had been overwhelmed in a traditional sense, but because they were no longer operating within a predictable pattern. And that disruption forced individual decisions that the new approach was better suited to exploit. Pilots who maintained discipline found themselves less entangled, less exposed, and more in control of when to engage again. And that control, subtle at first, began to redefine what success looked like. By the time the engagement ended, the results were clear enough to be noticed, but not yet understood in full. And as the formation regrouped, the significance of what had happened remained unsettled, not because it lacked impact, but because it challenged too many assumptions at once. What followed did not look like a revolution. It looked like a pattern that refused to disappear, and that made it harder for the system to ignore. In the days after that first mission, reports came in with a consistency that didn't match expectations. Bomber formations were returning with fewer losses, engagements were shorter, and pilots described encounters that felt controlled rather than reactive. Yet, none of this fit neatly into existing categories. Command initially treated it as variance, a temporary alignment of favorable conditions, because acknowledging it as something more would require questioning the structure they depended on. Zemke didn't argue for recognition. He continued applying the same approach, refining small details with each mission, adjusting timing, spacing, and altitude relationships based on what the previous outcomes revealed, and Harper kept documenting those changes, building a record that showed not isolated success, but a repeatable pattern. The effect began to extend beyond their group in ways that were subtle at first. Bomber crews started reporting fewer direct attacks during critical phases of their missions, not because the enemy had withdrawn, but because their formations were being disrupted before they could commit, and that shift altered how entire operations unfolded. Still, skepticism remained, especially from other fighter groups who attempted to replicate parts of the method without fully understanding the underlying logic, treating it as a sequence of actions rather than a system of decisions. And when their results didn't match, it reinforced the belief that Zemke's outcomes were situational rather than structural. The tension increased when a major mission resulted in heavy bomber losses despite escort presence, and critics pointed to it as evidence that no adjustment could overcome the scale of the threat, using that moment to argue that established doctrine, even with its limitations, was still the safest framework available. Zemke didn't dismiss that outcome. He analyzed it, identifying where the conditions prevented his approach from being applied as intended. And that distinction mattered, because it showed that the method wasn't universally dominant. It was conditionally effective, dependent on maintaining certain advantages that could be disrupted. Harper's analysis highlighted how deviations from the planned structure reduced the effectiveness of their engagements, not because the pilots performed poorly, but because the sequence of decisions that created control had been broken, and that insight reframed the discussion from whether the idea worked to when and how it could work. Meanwhile, within Zemke's own group, confidence grew not from a single decisive victory, but from repeated confirmation that their survival rates improved when they adhered to the new approach, and that internal shift began to change behavior at a deeper level. Pilots started thinking less about reacting to threats and more about shaping encounters before they fully developed. That change in mindset was the beginning of the broader domino effect, because it didn't require formal adoption to spread. It required observation, and other units began to notice that something was different about how these engagements unfolded. Reports circulated informally. Conversations between pilots from different groups carried fragments of the idea, and slowly the focus shifted from questioning whether Zemke was right to understanding why his results kept repeating. The system resisted that shift not through opposition, but through inertia, relying on existing training structures that couldn't easily incorporate a method built around flexibility and timing rather than fixed procedures. Yet each mission added another data point that aligned with the same conclusion, and over time, the accumulation of those points began to outweigh the arguments against them. What started as a single decision within one group had begun to influence how others interpreted their own experiences, and without a formal directive, the logic behind that decision was already moving beyond its original context, altering expectations in ways that could not be reversed simply by ignoring them. The change became unavoidable when results began to scale beyond the group that created them, because once multiple units started encountering the same pattern, the explanation could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. By early 1944, missions were growing larger, deeper, and more complex, requiring coordination across multiple fighter groups that did not share the same assumptions, and that difference exposed a new kind of tension inside the system. Some units still follow traditional engagement methods, staying close, reacting late, committing to prolonged encounters, while others had started experimenting with variations of Zemke's approach, not because they were ordered to, but because they had seen enough to question their own outcomes. This created an uneven structure where the same mission could produce entirely different results depending on how each group interpreted its role, and that inconsistency forced command to confront something it had been able to avoid before. Zemke was called to explain his methods, not in a setting designed for innovation, but in one designed for standardization, where the expectation was to translate individual success into repeatable instruction. He didn't present it as a tactic to copy, he described it as a sequence of decisions, shaped by the aircraft's characteristics, emphasizing that the key was not what pilots did, but when they chose to do it, and why. That distinction challenged the entire framework of training, because it shifted focus from fixed procedures to conditional judgment, something harder to teach and even harder to enforce. Harper supported the briefing with compiled mission data, showing how outcomes correlated with specific choices about positioning and timing. But even with that evidence, acceptance didn't come from agreement, it came from pressure. Missions continued, and the groups that adapted began to show measurable differences in both survival and effectiveness, while those that didn't found themselves facing the same problems with increasing frequency. The system didn't change because it was convinced. It changed because it was forced to operate alongside a method that kept producing results it couldn't replicate. During the large-scale operations that followed, including the sustained series of missions known as Big Week, the implications of that shift became more visible. Fighter groups began to coordinate not just around protecting bombers, but around controlling the airspace before threats could fully develop, and that adjustment altered the sequence of events across entire missions. The idea that had started as a decision within one group now influenced how multiple units approached their roles, creating layers of engagement that reduced exposure and redistributed risk in ways the original doctrine had not anticipated. When long-range escort missions extended deeper into enemy territory, including the unprecedented reach toward Berlin, the importance of that shift became even clearer, because the margin for error decreased while the cost of failure increased. Pilots operating under the newer approach were not relying on superior maneuvering, they were relying on maintaining control over when encounters occurred, preserving options rather than exhausting them. And that mindset allowed them to operate effectively, even under conditions that would have previously led to heavy losses. By the time preparations began for the invasion of Normandy, the accumulated effect of these changes had already reshaped expectations. Air superiority was no longer defined solely by winning engagements, but by preventing them from unfolding under unfavorable conditions in the first place. The early hours of June 6th reflected that shift in a way no report could fully capture, as patrols moved ahead of the invasion fleet, intercepting threats before they could organize, disrupting movements before they became attacks, and maintaining a level of control that had once seemed unattainable. What made that possible was not a single improvement in performance, but the continued application of a decision that had redefined how engagements were structured. And by that point, the system had adapted not because it fully understood the reasoning, but because it had no alternative that produced comparable results. By the time the war moved toward its final phase, the change no longer looked like a decision. It looked like something that had always been there, as if the system had quietly rewritten its own memory to accommodate it. The 56th Fighter Group continued operating with the same aircraft, the same limitations, and yet their results stood apart, not because they had better equipment, but because they no longer depended on the assumptions that had once defined success. Zemke eventually moved on to another unit, carrying the same approach into a different context, where it proved adaptable rather than tied to a single machine, and that detail mattered more than any single mission, because it showed that what he had identified was not a workaround, it was a principle. Back in his former group, the method continued without him, not as an order but as a shared understanding. something new pilots absorbed through observation rather than instruction, and that quiet continuity revealed the full extent of the domino effect. It had moved from one person's analysis to a group's behavior, then into a broader operational pattern, and finally into a standard that no longer needed to be explained to exist. After the war, when reports were compiled and numbers compared, the outcomes could be measured in totals and statistics. But those measurements only captured what happened, not why it happened, and the reason remained less visible because it did not fit into traditional categories of heroism or technological advancement. Zemke himself did not become a symbol in the way others did, partly because what he changed was not dramatic in appearance. It did not involve a new weapon or a decisive battle. It involved a shift in thinking that removed the need for certain kinds of risk, rather than confronting them directly. Harper returned to civilian life, his work largely unrecognized outside the records he helped create. Yet the analytical approach he contributed had already been absorbed into how future pilots were trained to evaluate their aircraft and their environment. The broader system, having resisted the change at first, eventually incorporated it so completely that its origins became less distinct, and later generations applied similar principles without knowing exactly where they had come from. What remains difficult to measure is what would have happened if that initial decision had never been made, if Zemke had accepted the limitations as they were presented and continued operating within the established framework. The bombers would still have flown, the missions would still have been carried out, but the patterns of loss and survival might have followed a different trajectory, one shaped by habits that no one thought to question. That uncertainty cannot be resolved with certainty, and perhaps it is not meant to be, because the value of what happened does not depend on proving an alternative outcome. It depends on recognizing how easily systems can overlook solutions that do not match their expectations. The lesson is not that one person changed the war alone, but that a specific kind of thinking, grounded in understanding rather than assumption, can alter the conditions under which entire systems operate. In a structure designed to reward consistency, the most significant change came from someone who identified where consistency had become a limitation and chose to act on that insight despite the resistance it created. The question that remains is not whether that decision was inevitable, but whether it would have been made at all if the circumstances had been slightly different, if the data had been ignored, or if the pressure to conform had been stronger than the willingness to question. And that question extends beyond the context of war, because systems in any field tend to preserve what works until it no longer does, and by then, the cost of waiting can be far greater than the risk of reconsidering what seems certain.